Alrighty. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. My name is Kristin Ronai. I'm the Director of Compliance for the OHSAA, and my colleague, Mr. Ronald Sayers, is assisting me as the moderator and will be helping us in facilitating the questions that come through. So before we begin, just a couple logistical items for you guys. First is a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted online by the end of the week. There will also be a similar meeting on Monday, April 19th at 9 a.m. for those who are unable to join us today. If you have any questions or would like further clarification on any items presented today, please simply just type in your questions or comment into the sidebar, and Mr. Sayers will then pose these questions to me at the appropriate time for further clarification. And finally, I wanted to let you know that Mr. Sayers and I are always willing to provide additional presentations or answer any one-on-one questions which may arise as a result of this presentation. We are here to serve you with clarity, consistency, and compassion, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us afterwards if needed. So before we get into the content, we would be remiss if we didn't take every opportunity we had to thank you, the school administrators and district and state board members, for all the work you have put in over the past year. And sorry to all the Blue Devil fans out there, but as Dean Smith used to have his teams point to the passer when someone assisted a player with a score, this association is pointing and recognizing each of you today. We could not have conducted our fall or winter tournaments without the efforts of each of you enforcing ever-changing social distancing guidelines, mask mandates, and venue capacities. Let's all keep up the great work and be sure to get our spring athletes to the tournaments they have worked so hard for. With respect to this meeting, and in accordance with Constitution Article 8.110, today we will be presenting the approved 2021 referendum items for public explanation and discussion. We will also be providing brief updates on some important topics regarding education-based athletics in Ohio at the end of this presentation. But first, we're going to start with the review of the referendum items. As a reminder, making changes to your Constitution articles and bylaws is outlined in Article 8. These modifications are voted upon in May by the member school principals and become effective by a majority vote. This year, there is one Constitution issue and 8 bylaw proposals, all of which were approved by the Board of Directors. There is also a petition option to change rules, but no individual carried out that option this year. If these items presented are passed, they will become effective August 1st unless otherwise specified, and there are 2 this year, which if passed will become effective May 16th, 2021. And I'll talk about those once we get to them in the presentation. As was done last year, voting will be conducted within OHSAA by the school principal's account. The link will become active on May 1st, 2021, and the ballot is due by May 15th at 4 o'clock. Please take note that May 15th is a Saturday this year, so I would strongly encourage the principals to do your voting early so you don't forget or run into problems and be in a position where you cannot contact an OHSAA staff member on a Saturday. Article 819 does require each school to return a ballot, but there will be an option to abstain from voting on any particular issue if it's so desired. This year, there are no 7th and 8th grade specific issues, so the ballot will only present for high school principals. There will be no obligation for 7th or 8th grade principals to vote this year. Because of the importance of these rule changes, we do encourage you to discuss them with your school boards, administrative teams, other area schools, etc. You can also discuss them at any upcoming league meetings, and as mentioned, feel free to reach out to the compliance team for any clarification you may need prior to voting. So for ease of comprehension, the language included in this presentation represents abridged or condensed formatted referendum items. I would strongly encourage you to right now take a moment and pull up the full text of these referendum items by clicking on the link which was sent to you in the reminder email this morning, or you can access the link on ohsaa.org by clicking on School Resources, going down to the bottom and clicking on the referendum voting, and clicking on 2021 referendum voting information. Once there, you'll click on the April 9th referendum items and we'll be set to go. So the first issue for your consideration is an exception to the referendum voting deadline, which came about since this year was the first year the deadline fell on a weekend after the implementation of online voting. In years past, the deadline has always been May 15th at 4 p.m., but we never want schools to face problems with technology or not have access to the staff if there are any questions about a certain issue. So the proposal is added here as an exception to change the deadline to 4 o'clock p.m. on the next business day if May 15th falls on a weekend or a holiday. This one is pretty straightforward and comes as a direct result of the advancements in technology our office has been able to implement. It should be noted that if this passes, this issue will become effective May 16th, 2021. So that is the only Constitution issue that you're going to vote on this May. The rest are all bylaw issues. And the next issue is represented as issue 1B and would be an editorial change to the language to bylaw 224, which is the competitive balance tiering process for public schools. It's important to note that there is no change in actual application with this issue. You can see the exact language on the bottom of page 1 on the website if you're following along, and you'll see that there's two different changes. The first is changing the word parent to legal guardian. This is because the executive director's office has been questioned on different interpretations when a student lives within a public school district, but with a non-parent who has legal custody. In reviewing the past guidance and discussions with the Competitive Balance Committee, a change from the word parent to legal custodian more accurately reflects the intention of this tier analysis. The second change cleans up the language for the Tier 1 to show that there are two distinct ways a student in a multi-high school district could be coded as Tier 1. The first is if they live outside the district but have been continuously enrolled in the district since the start of 7th grade. Or the second way is if they do live inside the district but attend a school outside their assigned attendance zones. The current language as it's written puts an unnecessary review on a student's educational history if they've lived in the district, but just within a different attendance zone. Again, this proposed change is simply editorial to show that there are two distinct ways a student in a multi-high school district can be coded as Tier 1. The next issue is issue 2B, and it is actually a new regulation which would be codified under bylaw 413 if it ultimately passes. This issue is being proposed because the executive director's office is often questioned on what ineligible students are and are not permitted to do during their period of ineligibility. To specify, this would be applicable for a student who is ineligible to grades, transfer, an ejection, or any other regulation which requires a period of ineligibility. You can see the new language here at the bottom, and it would provide clear guidance that an ineligible student is not allowed to participate in any sports contest, but that they are also not allowed to be dressed in full uniform for any such contest, and they would not be allowed to participate in pregame warm-ups during their period of ineligibility. However, this rule does still give discretionary authority to each school to determine if you want to allow an ineligible athlete to continue to practice with the team, travel with the team, sit on the team bench, but just not in full uniform. These final items are completely up to the school administrator. One of the questions which was already posed with respect to this new rule was, what about senior night athletes who are ineligible? What can they do? And we would not consider the senior night presentation before a contest as either part of the contest or part of the official warm-up. So if you wanted to, you would be allowed to allow ineligible seniors to be fully dressed for this type of presentation before the game, but then they would have to remove their uniform for the actual contest in accordance with this bylaw if it would then pass. The next issue is issue 3B, It is, oh, excuse me, yes, issue 3B. It is another editorial clarification which was recommended by a member of our appeals panel and approved by our board of directors. The addition, if approved, would add language to bylaw 431 exception 6, which is the rule that allows certain classifications of non-enrolled students to play sports for their residential public school. The exact language can be found online, shaded in the gray at the bottom of page 2. But in short, this addition is being recommended to remind administrators that these students participating in accordance with state law are still subject to all other areas of bylaw 4, which is the student eligibility bylaw. Specifically, and I've done a few presentations about this in our monthly updates, is that we are concerned that students who start at their local public school and who then transfer to home education or to an online school are not being coded or correctly identified as transfer students. They are changing their enrollment from one school to a different school. So even though they may be allowed to keep playing sports at your school in accordance with state law, when they withdrew, they then forfeited their opportunity for full eligibility. They changed their enrollment and attendance, which makes them a transfer student who is subject to the transfer consequence unless they can meet an exception to restore full eligibility. Later in this presentation, I'll talk about a common exception that you'll likely be able to use for these students, but it will require a decision on the family's part. We'll get to that later. But for this particular issue, 3B, the point is that language is being added to help school administrators recognize different areas of eligibility non-enrolled students could potentially be impacted by. The next issue is 4B, which is another sort of editorial change that would clarify the application of the transfer bylaw to reflect two things: that an ineligible transfer student is not allowed to participate in any OHSAA tournament games, and that they are permitted to play for the approved number of regular season contests, which is 50% of the maximum allowable. That is true even after the tournament has commenced. Accordance with this chart here that we added, this issue is brought to our attention with the modifications of last year's football schedule, with some teams only playing 3 or 4 regular season games prior to entering the tournament. I'll direct your attention again to the chart. In this case, a student who potentially did not meet an exception was ineligible for the tournament and then became eligible again for game number 5 because that was still within that first 50%, and then they would become ineligible for game number 6 and for the rest of the season. Again, we always want to make sure they can play for the first 50%, but they're always ineligible for the tournament. And this sort of language that proposed just cleans this up. The final change in issue 4B is this last bullet point here, and it's related to the note which precedes the different exceptions to bylaw 472. If you have your handbook, this note is located right underneath the transfer chart, and it has been rewritten to show that the exceptions are intended to be used for cause and effect situations, like when a family moves and their child is forced to transfer to a new school. The exceptions are not intended to be used as loopholes for students who want to transfer to a new school, so their family decides they want to transfer, we'll go ahead and move to make sure full athletic eligibility is restored. This new language, if approved, would give the executive director's office some discretion in trying to stop those who are trying to cheat the system and use these exceptions as loopholes. Issue 5B, as presented here, has a lot of new language and strikeouts of the old language, but there is not as much change as what might initially be perceived. As a reminder, the bylaw we're dealing with here, bylaw 472, exception 9, allows a student to transfer to a school located in the district where the student's residential parent or a legal custodian has lived for at least 1 year and not have to forfeit any athletic eligibility. If this issue passes, the first modification would give the executive director's office some discretion in the actual application, instead of making this an exception to which a student is entitled. You would also be adding the phrase transfer of participation opportunity to the first sentence to clarify that non-enrolled students are also permitted to use this exception, but it is only a one-time use to restore their full athletic eligibility. This is a very important point, which I briefly talked about earlier, to make sure non-enrolled students are eligible in all respects. So follow with me here. If a student starts at a public school and transfers to an online community school, for example, they can use exception 9 to restore their full athletic eligibility back at the public school they previously attended, assuming their parents live in that district, of course. But that is the only time the student would be able to use this exception. If they end up physically transferring back to the public school at a later date after already using exception 9 as a non-enrolled student, then they would have to fulfill the transfer consequence. So those are some decisions that families are going to have to make about when they want to potentially use this exception 9. The last and rather substantial change to this exception is the new language in Note 1, which, if approved, would allow a multi-high school district superintendent to request the application of this rule at a high school outside of the student's assigned attendance zone or at a school not closest to the parent's residence in districts that do not have defined attendance zones. But this can only be used if the transfer to the other school can be supported by objective educational criteria. We have received much feedback that students in multiple high school districts were being forced to pick between academics or athletics when transferring back into the district because their preferred education option did not align with the school at which they were permitted to utilize exception 9. This new language would allow the district to request this application at a different district other than what they would have been assigned. Some examples of some objective educational criteria that we would be considering is if a student would otherwise have been assigned to maybe a poor performing school, or if they want to transfer to a trade specific type of school for a career path. Any request for this sort of exception will be requested by the students, the students' transcripts to make sure that this reasoning is being supported. And one last thing to note here, the effective date of this amendment, if passed, would be May 16th, 2021. Therefore, if a student in a multi-high school district transfers between May 16th and June 31st of this year, then the student would still be permitted to potentially utilize this new language within note number 1. All right, 3 more issues here. The next one up is issue 6B, and it talks about bylaw 473, which is the mid-season transfer rule. Again, as a reminder, this rule essentially prevents a student from playing for 2 different schools during the same season. With respect to the proposed modification, the stricken language in the first paragraph removes the reference to the fact that the student isn't eligible at the school to which the student transferred. So there have been occasions where a student transfers in the middle of a season and wants to, maybe to an online community school, and wants to resume participation back at the school where they are no longer enrolled in accordance with state law. This proposed language cleans up that fact to explain that if a student transfers in the middle of the season, then he or she is ineligible for the rest of the season, regardless of where he or she desires a continued participation opportunity. Secondly, the new highlighted language to paragraph 1, again, if you're following along online, talks about the application of the transfer consequence for the next season whenever a mid-season transfer occurs. This type of rule has pretty significant implications and has caused some forfeitures in the past, so I'm going to make sure that we take some time to explain it here. This concept is actually currently found within bylaw 472, but because of its importance, we wanted to move that language into bylaw 473 where it's actually applicable. So in layman's terms, and follow along with me here if you're a visual learner, if a student transfers during a basketball season in which they have already played in a regular season contest at a different school, And if the new school has 3 regular season games left on their basketball schedule, the student sits out of those 3 games and then the tournament. And if they don't meet any exception, then next year they will sit out for the first 8 regular season games, including their scrimmages as well. And then this would equal a total of 11 regular season games sat out, 3 from the first year and 8 from the second year. This would equal that 11 game transfer consequence in basketball, and the student would then become eligible for game number 9. The reason that this rule was implemented is because you don't want to have students missing 2 different tournaments. So the phrase that we use is proration that these students get. So that language is new to this particular bylaw, but it's not new in application because it's currently codified within bylaw 472. The last change within this particular issue is to clarify what sports season is for application of this rule. Previously, the language encompassed a student who transferred at any time within the season, potentially even after their new school was eliminated from the tournament. And as mentioned, the concept behind this proration is to ensure that a mid-season transfer student does not have to miss 2 postseason tournaments. Therefore, this bylaw only comes into effect if a student transfers to a school that still has contests, either regular season or postseason, left on their schedule. If a student transfers to a new school after their team has concluded its participation in contests, then the student would have a normal transfer consequence the following year, unless, of course, an exception can be met to restore full athletic eligibility. All right. Let me get here. So the next issue, if you've kind of zoned out a little bit on some of these transfer issues, I want to get you to lock back into this next topic. Issue 7B is a pretty significant amendment to some of the recruiting bylaws. In general, these edits are being proposed to provide more clarity within these rules to make them easier to follow, but I am going to go through the highlights of some of these changes and would encourage you to either write your questions in the comment section or reach out to me afterwards for more clarification. So the first thing it does is within bylaw 492, it clarifies that it is permissible for a non-public school coach to have contact with 7th and 8th grade students if the non-public school is K through 12 and if the 7th and 8th grade building is located in the same building as the high school and when the students would otherwise be assigned to attend. This is similar to single district public high schools who have their 7th and 8th graders who would then be going to their high schools. There's also a new note to bylaw 492 exception 2 to clarify that non-public school boundaries used for competitive balance are not the same as those referenced in this bylaw when talking about when non-public school coaches can contact prospective student athletes. The next thing I'd like to highlight is within bylaw 493 number 2. It clarifies that schools who utilize mailings or electronic transmission for admission to for admission recruitment can't send information to people by their name until a student has attended an open house or information session. Prior to them doing that, the school would need to use occupant or residence. But again, this can only be done by the school's admission. It's not to be done by a coach and it's not to be done for athletic reasons. Within bylaw 494, number 3, it clarifies that a coach is allowed to talk to a student during a shadow day in the presence of a school administrator if the conversation centers around program procedures and expectations, but not on the student's expected impact on the program. And again, this needs to be done in the presence of a school administrator. And if a coach also serves as the administrator, such as the coach also being the athletic director, then the school principal should be involved to facilitate that conversation. Some more additions to this particular recruiting bylaw. There was language removed to allow the executive director's office to approve an offsite open house, even if a school might have other campus facilities available. This gives schools more options when deciding where to conduct these type of open house meetings. And the option is also now presented as an exception. Within bylaw 493, number 5, we added that if a school wins a state championship, that congratulatory billboards and newspaper ads are allowed as long as the marketing is congratulatory in nature and not used to promote the athletic program. You can't just have an athletic billboard, as that would be a violation of this recruiting bylaw. Bylaw 493, number 6, has been modified to really clean up the language for camps that occur during the summer, and it clarifies that they're solely to be used for a specific non-interscholastic opportunity. They are not supposed to be used to promote the school, and there's not supposed to be admissions personnel or administrators in person at these summer camps. It's strictly, again, to be a non-interscholastic opportunity, and the invitations to these cannot be sent to specific individuals by name. And the last rather substantial change to this recruiting bylaw is a clarification on when schools and coaches can contact students. They've been modified to provide further clarification on when the unobstructed communication can occur, specifically that students and coaches are not allowed to contact a prospective student athlete, even if they shadow at a school, until 1, if the student's application fee is submitted to the school for non-public schools, or 2, if the school accepts the student's application fee accepts the student's application for enrollment for non-tuition based schools. So once either of those things occur, then a school and a coach is allowed to contact these students, but this contact should not be occurring until either the application fee is being submitted for tuition based schools, or when the student's application is submitted for non-tuition based schools. So that was a lot there with the recruiting bylaw. I'm sure we'll have some questions here, but before we get to those, I do want to address this last issue, issue 8B, which modifies bylaw 9. This is the bylaw which deals with contests requiring special attention. The language starts, if you're following along online, in the middle of page 11, and you can see that there are 3 basic adjustments. The first is that it clarifies that member schools are allowed to play non-member schools or non-interscholastic teams at their own discretion. That was never really clarified anywhere, so we wanted to make sure that we added that. If this passes, it would require approval from the OHSAA office prior to schools traveling to any non-bordering state or province to play. This would include traveling to Florida for your baseball and softball spring trips. Previously, you did not have to obtain permission from the OHSAA office, but a change to this rule we are putting forward because with the changes and the sanctioning that I'm going to discuss here in just a moment, we do want to make sure that schools are not attending any events without the proper sanction. So you will need to get approval from the office prior to traveling to any non-bordering state. And then the last change provides new stipulations in bylaw 923 to comply with the revised NFHS sanctioning requirements. So there's now 3 types of events in which a school would need to secure a sanction through the National Federation of State High School Associations. The first is any event which includes either an Ohio or an out-of-state school that is co-sponsored by or titled in the name of an organization outside of the school community. The second is if there are events involving non-bordering states where 5 or more states are involved. The third is events involving non-bordering states if there are more than 8 schools involved. And then the last is events involving 2 or more schools that include a team from a foreign country, with the exception of Canada and Mexico. So that completes the public presentation of the 9 approved 2021 referendum items, which we made available to member school principals to vote upon between May 1st and May 15th. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and field any questions which may have come in regarding these specific topics. And after fielding these questions, there will be just a few more reminders before we conclude here. So Mr. Sayers, any questions that came in?
So we actually do not have any questions.
Okay.
So it's to you for being extremely expansive on your explanations. So we will just move forward.
Okay. Well, again, I know sometimes people can be a little shy with questioning these, and if you do have any that arise later on, again, please feel free to reach out to us, and we are happy to explain these. A few additional other reminders before we conclude. Again, is that the scholarship bylaw has been waived through the first grading period of the next school year. But the thing that we want to make sure that you are focusing on is that athletes are doing their scheduling right now. So you need to make sure that they are scheduling for a minimum of 5 credits at the high school level and 4 classes at the 7th and 8th grade level to make sure that they have enough credits for the first grading period. Because if they don't, their ineligibility would commence with the second grading period of the 21-22 school year if they did not either schedule enough or pass enough classes during that first grading period. The second reminder is that due to a concern of the data collected, the data that would have been collected in October of 2020, the OHSAA office made the recommendation to the board of directors to go ahead and reuse the tournament divisions from this current school year for a final year during the 21-22 school year. Therefore, all member schools will remain in the same divisions as this year, and new EMIS numbers will be collected this October for application during the 22-23 and 23-24 school years. Schools will have the opportunity to appeal these October 2021 numbers, and we encourage you to pay close attention during this appeal process because we have had some schools who have tried to appeal after the fact. And then the new divisional alignments for fall and winter will be released in the spring of 2022, and the spring divisional alignments will be released in August of 2022 after the completion of the spring sport tournaments. A few final updates is that the pre-participation physical evaluation form and the accompanying documents will be posted by no later than this coming Friday. I checked the morning and they were not up yet, but our Joint Advisory of Sports Medicine Committee is working on adding a section regarding COVID history. So be on the lookout for those. They should be posted by this coming Friday, April 16th. A reminder that there was a change to the General Sport Regulations 751 and that coaches are now allowed to have unrestricted contact with athletes from June 1st to July 31st of this summer. It used to be limited to 10 days, but that's no longer there. This does not extend into August, and no decision has been made on whether to continue this regulation into the future. So just know that during this summer, there is unlimited, unrestricted contact between June 1st and July 31st. A reminder to keep reviewing the weekly administrator updates for COVID-related reminders and updates. If you reviewed your memo from last Friday, it expressed that there are no longer any spectator capacity limitations for outdoor venues. So just making sure you're staying up to date on those and contacting our office if you do have follow-up questions on any of those reminders or updates that the Ohio Department of Health puts out. And the last reminder is that the Executive Director's Office does plan to make a recommendation on membership dues and fees at this coming April 22nd board meeting. So if you've not already done so, please ensure that you view Executive Director's presentation on this important subject and contact our office if you have any questions or need additional clarification. So that is the end of the presentation. Ronald, I'll reach out one final time to see, are there any questions that came in?
So there are not.
Okay. Well, that then concludes this presentation. Both myself and Mr. Sayer's contact information is here. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time, and we are happy to help you. So thank you again for all you're doing for the student athletes in the state of Ohio, and be on the lookout for those ballots starting May 1st. Thank you all.